Hi and welcome to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times. I'm Lana, Deputy Editor here. This episode is sponsored by MSA Safety. Today we're hearing from Phil Garrigan, the new chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council. And you might know Phil from his time as Chief Fire Officer at Merseyside, where he spent over 3 decades in the fire service. He's now stepped into a national leadership role, and just a few weeks into the job, he sat down with Catherine to talk about what's top of his agenda. Phil shares what it's been like moving from a local operational role to leading a digital-first national organisation with over 100 staff and a £10 million budget. He talks about some of the challenges of working at a distance, the leadership approach that he's bringing to the NFCC, and why servant leadership still drives everything he does. They also talk about some of the biggest challenges facing fire and rescue services today, so from improving culture and professional standards to climate resilience, funding pressures, and the role of the fire service in national emergencies. With fire policy now back under the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, Phil also talks about how the NFCC is really working to build strong relationships with government and make sure that all aspects of fire, beyond just that built environment, stay on the agenda. So let's have a listen to the conversation.
Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Phil Garrigan, new chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council. Welcome, Phil.
Hello, Catherine.
It's great to speak to you and talk to you about your new role so early on in your tenure. So first up, let's find out a little bit about you because you haven't been chair for very long. You were previously Chief Fire Officer in Merseyside. So what motivated you to leave that role and take up this national position?
I suppose ultimately 35 years service. So I spent joined Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service in 1990, and I'd kind of set my stall out very early on to do 35 years and retire at 55, and I am true to my word, so that's exactly what I did. And there's a couple of other factors which play a part in. I think, genuinely, the chief fire officers have a tenure in role. So I've been I was the chief of Merseyside for 7 years, and it just felt like the right time. And that was combined with the fact that Mark Harding, the previous chair of the National Fire Chiefs, was due to retire on the 1st of April. So I relinquished my role in Merseyside on the 31st of March and started with the National Fire Chiefs on the 1st of April.
Fantastic. So the NFCC describes itself as a digital-first organisation with 130 staff and a £10 million budget, mostly from government. How does that compare with running a metropolitan fire and rescue service?
The budget's, small in comparison. And that the whole kind of digital organisation is different too. I'm used to going into an office and going onto fire stations and engaging face to face with people. And so it is a challenge for me. It's different for me. It's a different way of working that I'm trying my hardest to meet people, face to face and physically, but you are reliant on, Zoom and Teams to be able to kind of communicate effectively. So it's a different way, and I'm getting my head around the difference. But I still want to be approachable, accessible. I still want to know how things are going for people in their work life, but also their home life. So I'm trying to now work out how I create the space for those kind of conversations to take place rather than it just be transactional in regards to meetings and getting the job done. Yeah,
so you're missing having an office then, so a base for that sort of day-to-day coffee moments as well.
Yeah, all the kind of the normal human interactions are really important to me, and some of those kind of conversations around the coffee machine or in a corridor. Sometimes you get real insights into how the organisation's functioning and things that are getting in the way of people's, ability to do their job. And so I don't underestimate the value of that, and also the creativity. I really I've spent the last, 35, but probably more particularly the last 15, where I've been engaged in kind of conversations and exploring how we can better do things and whether there's alternative ways to do it. If you sat in front of a screen, sometimes you don't get that opportunity to be as challenging. It's a kind of a bit of a superficial environment that you find yourself in. And I'm trying to now have conversations with them, with the team in the National Fire Chiefs to be challenging of each other, which is difficult through a screen. You can't read people's body language as much as you would do face to face and in the same room. So we're working on that, because that kind of constructive challenge, that thirst to continue to improve, is really important for me, and will be for the National Fire Chiefs, but also for fire and rescue services more broadly.
Yes, and so running a professional body like the National Fire Chiefs Council, you need some very special leadership skills. Can you share how you go about influencing and bringing people with you when they're all leaders in their own right?
Well, I suppose it's twofold that. Firstly, I've got a team to look after. And that's a little bit of a newer team. So about just over 100 people who work for the National Fire Chiefs Council, and they're supporting fire and rescue services in the work that they do every day. That's one thing. And then I've obviously got a different team, which is, the chiefs of fire and rescue service, the length and breadth of the country. And so my skills are different dependent on the kind of group of people I'm talking to, and how well informed they are, and the leadership roles that they hold in their own services. So my own team as it stands, they don't know me. I'm 4 weeks into the role. I operate differently than Mark Harding, the previous chair. And when we're getting to understand what's important to me, and the way I kind of work, and I want to be really inclusive in those conversations. I want them to be conversational. I want us to work together to find solutions to some of the problems that are taxing fire and rescue services and support fire and rescue services. And then you kind of you lean across to think about the chief fire officers in their roles and supporting them to deliver the best possible outcomes for the community. Because whilst you described NFCC as a digital first organisation, I describe the fire and rescue service as a community first organisation, and the people who work within it come a very close second to that. But the fact of the matter is, we're here to serve the public, and I am here to help chief fire officers to deliver the best possible outcomes for the public that they serve. So how do you do that? By listening, by understanding what the challenges that they face are, and by trying to find solutions to that. And I've said many times in conversation that I was always trying to grapple with my leadership style. Certainly when I was moving through the managerial roles within Merseyside, and I kind of landed on one which seemed a bit passive at the time, but it absolutely reflects my leadership style, which is servant leadership. And the basis of it, Catherine, is that you try and take away some of the barriers for people to do their job. And so the skill for me is to take away barriers for fire and rescue services and chief fire officers, to allow them to do their job as effectively as they possibly can, and my team to support that in any way, shape or form they can. So look, that's so how does that manifest in a leadership role? You lead from the front, you are on the front foot. I very seldom take a backward step, but my pursuit of improvements is absolutely what drives me, and the real focusing on doing the right thing for the public. 35 years of it's been obvious to me what that doing the right thing looks like, but I'm trying to instill in the psyche of the NFCC now, where whether you're working in an administrative role somewhere and you're supporting a meeting in some way, shape or form, but that's still contributing to the successful delivery of positive outcomes for communities. So I don't know, lead by example, and continue that pursuit of improvement. And I talk about marginal gains. I talk about just kind of surfacing a better way to do some things that might be even just slightly better than the previous one. And look, and people talk and wax lyrical about leadership. It's about care, and it's about taking responsibility. It's about supporting people to deliver. And I think that's crucially important.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot in all of that. I wonder if, because you were vice chair for 2 years, you were able to test all of that out and see that actually did work in that environment of working with other chiefs that's not your staff. So obviously you've been successful now, you're continuing to use that same style.
Yeah, and I can't change it. That's the type of person I am. So, and they're the things that motivate me, really. The interpersonal relationships, but the drive to put the public first. And you're right. I was the vice chair. I said in my submission, and I mean this wholeheartedly, really. I said in my submission, I'll work really hard, to support fire and rescue services, to implement change, to improve, to get better, to better serve the public. But equally, I'm no shrinking violet. So in the nicest possible way, I'm reasonably forthright in what my expectations of people are. And that extends to, to people who work for the NFCC and the responsibilities we hold with the public. And so, and people know that. And I said at the time, if I don't think people are behaving in the way that they should be behaving, I will call it out, and I will, I won't defend the indefensible, and that remains true. But that's a relationship struck with trust and respect, and hope. I've got absolute respect for my colleagues, and I suppose I wouldn't be in this position if they didn't have the respect for me to be able to represent their views, both, in service, but also into different key stakeholders and into government. So I'm reassured by the fact that they've put me in this position. They have faith in me to take that forward. But equally, they know what my values are and what my behaviours are, because they've witnessed them for the last 4 years and still chose to pick me.
And that's a good segue to my next question, which is around how you do deal with stakeholders and looking particularly at government. So you've taken on this role as fire policy has moved from the Home Office to MHCLG, having been out of there for nearly 10 years. I wondered what your views were on that, and whether you think it's good for the fire and rescue service, and how the NFCC positions itself with the policy now back in with building safety and all the other bits of fire. Is that a good thing?
Yeah, look, it's the jury's out, and I don't mean that in a negative way, really. Time will tell, I suppose. We've had really strong working relationships with Home Office colleagues, and I have particularly because I was the Chief Fire Officer of Merseyside, and we had national responsibilities for national coordination of response, so national resilience, and also international search and rescue. So we had a particularly close working relationship as the lead authority, and look, and the delivery of anything is based on relationships, and so strong working relationships built on trust allows you to take on some challenges which you might not ordinarily do if you don't have those working relationships really kind of built into your DNA and your ways of working. And don't get me wrong, some of the people who have within Home Office and have continued to remain in that similar role based on the transition from Home Office to MHCLG, but it's different, and the move to MHCLG kind of covers off a significant concern around fire safety in the built environment, really, in regards to that kind of one place where there's real laser focus on a particular problematic area post Grenfell, and Grenfell's a really significant issue for the fire and rescue service, and not just in relation to the built environment, but other factors which are at play, which may not be clear in the recommendations, but self-evidently we have made that move across, and it's very much focused on or seeing things through a protection lens and working with MHCLG. And my challenge is to ensure that they don't miss the other work that the fire and rescue service do, which has been part and parcel of the way that we've worked with police colleagues in the past, and certainly Home Office around things like serious violence duty and so on and so forth. Some of the work we do in communities around tackling antisocial behaviour and crime. Now, you don't just leave that behind when you leave the Home Office, because that's still part and parcel of what the fire and rescue service is about and how it supports our communities in its broader sense. But it is change, and it is a transition, and we are having to, nationally, not just individually, we're having to build those relationships again and demonstrate firsthand the skills that we hold, the capabilities that we have, and our ability to get some stuff done. And look, and that will come. That's my, that's part and parcel of my job for the next 4 years. As I would say this, wouldn't I, coming from the sector, but the Fire and Rescue Service deliver. They step in during periods of crisis without hesitation. And that bit is somewhere where I think we can exploit and certainly add value to MHCLG and our ability to respond and be resilient during a crisis.
Yes, and those conversations that you're having with the Fire Minister, Alex Norris, as it is now, do you have like a priority list, the kind of things you're seeking to influence? How do you kind of work that relationship?
Yeah, well, clearly I've got some things that I want to have a conversation with the Minister about, and probably primacy at this moment in time, because it underpins a significant part of our delivery, is around funding and comprehensive spending review. And look, and whilst I would want to see reinvestment back into the Fire and Rescue Service, because in reality we're probably the only emergency service which hasn't returned to pre-austerity levels around numbers. And equally, there are things and challenges facing the Fire and Rescue Service that need some inward investment, both in regards to the infrastructure, the central kind of provisions, but also they manifest themselves onto and into fire stations where we talk about improvements in diversity, and we've still got stations that don't and can't accommodate a more diverse workforce. We still haven't seen capital investments over an extended period of time, which has allowed us to counter respond to some of the well-being risks around contaminants and putting in place measures which mitigate against those risks. So there's a number of kind of topics that we want to discuss, and look, and self-evidently there's a number of areas that the Minister would like to discuss with me and more broadly the sector. They've reconstituted or constituted Ministerial Advisory Group. I think it's an exceptional decision. So it allows not just myself, it allows the trade unions and kind of key stakeholders to have joined up conversations around things that are important to the Fire and Rescue Service, and and work together to find solutions. Look, I genuinely think that's a really good step forward. Focused from
Did that meet under Diana Johnson? She had some meetings like that.
Yeah,
is it the same group moving forward? It's not different.
Yeah, and it's just transitioned across, and a couple of areas that they've spotlighted in the first instance are, and no surprise, and I know you'll probably want to talk to me about it. Culture, but also and conduct and misconduct, but also the kind of the considerations post Grenfell phase 2 of the College of Fire, and how that sits within an organisational kind of context, and what the logic and the reason behind it is, and what the functions of a college would be, and what model would we apply. So it's two-way. I am pushing for further investment back into the Fire and Rescue Service, because I see gaps in provision, and I can see areas where we can be better. And equally, the Minister has expectations on me and the sector more broadly around specific areas, but also, and I agree with him, by the way, stepping in during a crisis, irrespective of what that crisis looks like.
This episode of the Emergency Services Times podcast is sponsored by MSA Safety, proudly supporting emergency services and first responders on the front line. At MSA Safety, protecting first responders isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We work closely with fire and rescue services across the UK to develop and deliver safety solutions designed to meet your ever-evolving needs. That includes MSA Bristol Firefighter PPE, trusted by services across the UK and beyond, shaped through years of collaboration with frontline teams. It also includes our growing investment in innovation and technology, from the connected M1 SCBA modular solution to our agile, fully managed service model that helps keep crews protected and ready to respond. But for us, safety goes beyond equipment. We believe in standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, whether it's supporting firefighter charities, backing mental health initiatives, or showing up for community events. MSA is proud to be part of the Emergency Services family. To learn more about our work in the UK and how we're supporting first responders every step of the way, visit www.msasafety.com. With MSA Safety, when you go in, We go in with you.
Okay, so you've mentioned culture. I want to move on to that. It's useful to talk about the money and the funding process. A lot of that is very formulaic in a sense. You're going through a system and you're part of that system. But with culture, it's less about process, I think. So I'm interested to know what the NFCC is doing with culture at the moment. There was a report from the National the HMI. Services have had their own, but in terms of what you've seen now, where you sit in your position, what's the NFCC's position around improving culture in fire and rescue services so we don't keep having these reports?
Yeah, and look, and I am representative of chief fire officers. I'd say that from the outset as part and parcel of my role, but they can speak for themselves in regard to the culture that exists in their own services and how they're responding to that. But if I focus in on what the NFCC done, so you talk about some reviews that the fire and rescue services have undertaken. You've also had an independent review from the support panel into what the fire and rescue service more broadly in the NFCC's role, and it's very supportive actually, and it's very strategic in its principles and its calls for action. And it's about it's some of the basics, Catherine. If I'm honest with you, it's about creating opportunity to listen to people, to understand their views, to kind of to understand the processes that support an individual in the workplace and so on and so forth. So there has been an independent look at what we can do to support fire and rescue service more broadly around the cultural journey that they're going on. What you've also had is irrespective of the work that's been done by the HMI, those recommendations have been picked up by services at a local level, but equally nationally in regards to the role that the NFCC fulfill in supporting fire and rescue service. So we have, as you would expect, with the People, Culture and Leadership Committee, we've pored over every single one of those recommendations, and we've sought to respond to those recommendations through the production of an action plan. The first one's been discharged. A lot of the recommendations have been, or services have discharged with the support of the NFCC. And now we're moving on to phase 2 and starting to take it on to the next level and enhance that even further by reflecting back on what we've heard, what we've seen, and the observations from others. And what I would say, and again, this is maybe a little bit more of a kind of a personal observation, I suppose. I think we've seen significant improvements in regards to the reactions to poor culture in the fire and rescue service. I still think we're not, I don't think we're there yet. But equally, I think we've kind of maybe got a better understanding. And when we say we, I mean a collective we, because certainly my feel was early on when the cultural reviews were coming forward, there was a view that it was very much fire and rescue service leadership, and that was, they were responsible for a poor culture in an organisation. And they take huge responsibility. As a chief fire officer, I am responsible for the culture in my fire and rescue service. I absolutely understand that. But I suppose we moved away from language, and I think quite rightly, and when it was referenced in the Ministerial Advisory Group actually, from language which was about institutional to systemic. Okay, and when we talk about systemic issues affecting fire and rescue service, I think we are landing in the right place, because we recognise that there's more than one part of a system that has responsibility for culture, and that that extends to obviously fire and rescue service, the employees, but also the trade unions, also the local government association, the fire authority, the public to a greater or lesser degree, and government. And I kind of go back to, it's very difficult to change the way you approach the diversity of your organisation if your fire stations aren't fit for purpose and you haven't got the funding to be able to change them and create facilities which are welcoming and make people feel valued and so they belong. So everyone, part and parcel of that system, has to take some responsibility for the culture of the fire and rescue service. But I think that is recognised now. I think that part and parcel of the ministerial advisory focus on conduct, misconduct, and really that push towards improvement. And I think we are on the right path, but I still think there's more work to be done. And I still think we will occasionally, services, chief officers, others will drop the ball, and someone will need to pick it up. And I kind of go back to, if people are getting some of that stuff wrong, I won't be defending the indefensible.
Okay. It's interesting to talk about it as a system, because a lot of the discussion about culture seems to be about behaviour, about individuals, groups of individuals, watches, the nature of being very much in a sort of group for long periods of time. People have been there for a long, long time, not being very, very diverse. Do you think that behaviour is part of the system? Do you see it as that?
Yeah, of course, because you go back to that sense of belonging, and cultures develop on watches, cultures develop in organisations. I was even referencing, funny enough, different governmental departments have a different way of working at times, and it feels like there's a different culture that exists. And so, and they are based on behaviours, and behaviours being kind of normalised in certain areas, and it requires someone to step in and intervene.
Do you think the creation of professional standards units is a solution? The London Fire Brigade experience suggests that the volume of complaints is quite high and that they've had to put new staff in. What do you think other services are going to experience, or is London a one-off?
Well, look, I come from a fire and rescue service that's had a professional standards function for 10 years. So it's nothing new for me, that. And equally, I wouldn't shy away from people raising concerns. I kind of look at it from maybe a different perspective. We've had an independent reporting lines introduced into every fire and rescue service, and it's there for a reason, for people to raise kind of concerns about the behaviours that are being exhibited in their presence, and allowing people to do something about that, to tackle that. Because if you don't know these behaviours are getting exhibited, then you can't do anything about it. So, the introduction of independent reporting gives an individual a vehicle, a confidential vehicle to highlight some kind of concerns that they might have. And as a chief fire officer, I'm very grateful for that opportunity then to be able to intervene and to be able to support that person, albeit in an anonymous kind of way. And then you're into relation to the issues that kind of develop, and the increasing number of grievances or disciplinary conduct related matters. Well, if behaviours that are getting exhibited don't reflect the values of the fire and rescue service, then they need to be tackled. And you can tackle that via kind of education and informal means, but sometimes the behaviours that are exhibited need formal disciplinary processes to follow. And so you either look the other way or you take it head on. And so I think London Fire Brigade have done absolutely the right thing, and they're working through that process. When when you start to see real cultural improvement, you will start to see those numbers of kind of issues and complaints and concerns diminish. But it was always going to open, I suppose, a floodgate in the first instance, where people find that they've got now a vehicle for bringing those things to the attention of the organisation and others. And then that allows people to deal with it. So I'm not fearful of it. I think it's absolutely a necessity. And a successful functioning organisation where your culture is absolutely right is one where people feel as though they can bring those things to your attention without the necessity to use an anonymous reporting line. But if that's the vehicle in the first instance, to be able to provide that assurance that we will deal with that, or the service will deal with that on their behalf, then I don't think we should shy away from that at all.
Okay, so we've talked about the people and the culture, an important part of the system that you describe. I wonder if we can talk about the environment in which you're operating. So turning to climate change. We continue to see climate change impacts with more flooding and higher temperatures. What do you need from government to help fire and rescue services deal with this growing problem?
Look, over the last probably 4 weeks, or certainly since taking on the role, the frequency of my phone going and someone from the media wants to talk about wildfire has been significant. There's been a huge amount of contact, and that's because we are seeing a warmer start to the year. We've had over double the number of wildfires this year than we had back in 2022, when we had 14 major incidents declared. And so there's a real concern that there's a significant increase in the number of incidents that we're responding to based on climate change. And that's one aspect of it, wildfire. Then you extend that to, and quite comfortably, I've just sat through a thunderstorm here in, it's bright sunshine now, but there was a thunderstorm probably 30 minutes ago. So the potential for a really dry period to be followed by significant amounts of rainfall and wide area flooding is self-evident there too. So climate change is upon us. And people have this view that actually the number of incidents that the Fire and Rescue Service is responding to now is diminished. If you look at the statistics from government, what it would suggest is we've seen an increase in the number of incidents that we've responded to by in excess of 20%. So we're going to more incidents. A number of them are climate related. A number of them are about our broader role and supporting kind of our colleagues in the other blue light services. But we are not less busy than we were 10 years ago. We are busier, and you would want to see that investment back into the service. So we are equipped to deal with every eventuality and the foreseeable risk, of which climate change is absolutely at the forefront. And I said, previously, I've been in a fortunate position because over the last 10 days, I've been across to the US to talk about issues affecting the UK, but how they apply into America. And I've been to Ireland, and some of the primary kind of conversations. In fact, the primary conversation on the basis of LA and the wildfires there is climate change. But it's also climate change is the conversation in Ireland, and climate change is the conversation back into the UK. So we need to be on the front foot. We need to have the right capabilities to be able to deal with the risk. And we can't bury our head in the sand and suggest that it's a one-off. It isn't. We are getting, wetter winters, hotter summers, and and certainly extreme weather events, on both sides of that spectrum.
Yes, and so presumably your bid to the comprehensive spending review a large part of that will be driven by the changing risk that you've just described in order to get the resources to allow fire services to respond in an effective and efficient way. Is that what the basis of it will be? Yeah,
and looking, it's got a multitude of factors. It's about maintaining the national capabilities, the ability to respond to a large instance, but also to the recognition that we've got in the nicest possible way, we've got 11,000 firefighters less than we did have in 10 years ago, and our incidents are increasing, and have we got the right resources to be able to respond as effectively we would want to, with an increasing number of incidents, and also the increasing challenges that come with climate change. So we are making that case. We are asking that we government support us in providing assurance back into the public that we are suitably equipped and we're ready and willing and able to be able to respond to those challenges with the right skills, capabilities, and the requisite number of people to be able to do that effectively. So that is part of the comprehensive spending review, absolutely.
And that makes me think about the whole resilience arrangements. I feel that this government is spending more time on resilience than perhaps previous ones. And we've seen Pat McFadden, the resilience minister, talking about a review of resilience, having just launched a new UK Resilience Academy. Now there's talk of there's going to be a national pandemic exercise. So it strikes me that it's very much more on the agenda than perhaps it was before. Do you have any thoughts on what you'd like to see covered in that review that would enable what you've just talked about in terms of being able to put together the facets of your spending review, but also making sure that you're well and truly plugged into resilience more broadly than fire? What are your thoughts on how that contribution will look?
Yeah, and if you look at who's chairing a significant number of the local resilience forum these days, it's chief fire officers, supported by police colleagues, but it's self-evidently they are on the front foot, leading the collective response to civil contingent events. And I kind of go back, Catherine, to our capabilities and our ability to respond. And you only have to go back as far as COVID to recognise that the Fire and Rescue Service have the ability to step in during a crisis and support that collective response. And equally, you probably only have to look as far back as COVID to realise that you need I suppose all partners, all stakeholders to come together to respond to a crisis. And that extends probably to climate changes and some of the challenges that we've just previously talked about. But being able to mobilise those resources as part and parcel of that resilient, cohort is crucial. And I kind of talk, quite, at length, around the role of the Fire and Rescue Service, if I'm being blunt. So we kind of sometimes fixate on the Fire and Rescue Services Act, and quite rightly, the prevent, protect, respond. But actually, another key duty placed on the Fire and Rescue Service is built into the Civil Contingencies Act. And as a result of that, that's our ability to respond to an emergency and step forward in a crisis. So you look at some of the work that the National Fire Chiefs Council have done in regards to the Fire and Rescue Service being fit for the future. It talks at length about that. It talks about being really good at what we do and our statutory responsibilities. It talks about how we can help and support our other blue light responders in the kind of context of the challenges that they face. But it also talks about being able to, step in during a time of crisis when our communities are in desperate need of someone to do something. I don't know what that something is, dependent on the kind of the crises, but being there for them to help, support, and reassure. And I think that's a fundamental role for the Fire and Rescue Service. So I think there is more for us to do in a resilience kind of context than ever before. And I welcome government's focus on that. And I welcome the strengthening of the resilience arrangements that we would have in place. And I also, welcome the fact that, government's review of the national capabilities that the Fire and Rescue Service has got is at the forefront of their thinking. So whilst I am having challenging conversations about, comprehensive spend and review more broadly, the commitment to support Fire and Rescue Services around their ability to mobilise national assets on a national scale is self-evidently there.
Great. So we have come to time. I would love to talk to you much more about all sorts of topics, but unfortunately we don't have the time for this podcast. I think it just demonstrates quite how broad your role is, how much you've been able to tell me, given you've only been in the job since the 1st of April. There's an awful lot going on. But before I let you go, I'd like to ask you to provide some advice for our podcast listeners. We ask all of our guests to do this. So what piece of advice would you give our listeners, given everything you've talked about, and it has been very broad ranging? What's the kind of thing you'd like them to go and talk to somebody else about? What's the big takeaway here?
Interesting, because I could probably, dependent on what day it is or what time you've asked me the question and what's at the forefront of my mind, I could probably come up with 1,000,001 different answers. I suppose I'll land on risk appetite and doing the right thing. So, I suppose I'll have to kind of caveat that with an explanation. Doing the right thing is self-evident. I joined the Fire and Rescue Service to do the right thing, to step in during a time of crisis, not necessarily to put fires out, to serve the public to the best of my ability. And I want to ensure I do that. And I think for all of us in a change in society and a change the way people, mobilise and support each other and all of those things, there is a sense check for me around making sure that we still balance, the risks to ourselves with the risks to the public, and making sure that we are stepping forward when others would step away. And sometimes we've got to make sure that we are still doing the right thing for the right reasons, with the right safeguards in place to ensure that we are better equipped to respond than a member of the public, and that's stepping forward during a time of crisis. So whether that's one or two, I'm not sure, but nevertheless.
Okay, I'll let you have one. How about 1.5? Excellent. So that's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. We will see you hopefully at the Emergency Services Show in September in your new role, 17th and 18th at the NEC in Birmingham. And it just leaves me very happy to have spoken to you today. It's been a real pleasure. And to say thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Tom St. John for expertly producing this episode. If you like this episode, then be sure to check out other conversations with leaders in this season of For Every Response, sponsored by MSA Safety. Share the link and subscribe to receive updates on new episodes from us here at Emergency Services Times.